Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to look at one of the central topics in philosophy of biology, the question of biological individuality. And in particular we'll focus on organisms. So what is an organism? When does an entity count as a biological organism? Initially this might seem like a fairly simple question. When we look out at the natural world we see various discrete, clearly bounded entities. It's quite easy to identify organisms. But it turns out there are a lot of quite difficult cases once we go beyond the standard animals. Now, first of all, it's worth asking, why does any of this matter? What's the point of trying to clarify the concept of individuality? Well, individuality plays a very important role in biology. Consider, for example, natural selection. Natural selection is a process that involves the differential survival and reproduction of individuals, right? Natural selection requires some sort of population where the individuals in that population exhibit variation and survive and reproduce at different rates. It's the individual organisms that bear the variation and that either survive or die. So just on a conceptual level, we need to understand what makes something an individual. Selection requires individuals to select. And then there's, I guess, also a sort of practical element, right? When we study evolutionary processes, we might want to, for example, measure the fitness of a particular gene. We want to understand how a gene influences the ability to survive and reproduce. And in order to measure the fitness, well, I guess we might do a genetic analysis of a sample of individual organisms from different generations, and we see how the representation of that gene changes over time. If you're doing something like this, then you need to sample each individual only once, right? So imagine if you were to sample one of my cells. Well, you wouldn't then want to sample 10 more cells from my body. That would give you that would make it look as though there were 10 more individual organisms, which would make the gene look fitter than it was. So we need some way to distinguish one organism from another. Basically, the point is that biology is at least partially a counting science, where we're counting individual organisms. So that's why this matters. So we all have an intuitive sense of what an organism is. An organism is going to have a kind of clear boundary from the external environment. And within that boundary, there's going to be a functional integration of the parts. So if I chop off my hand, it's no longer part of me. It's no longer part of the biological organism, because the organism should be connected and integrated. Organisms maintain homeostasis, so it's going to maintain a stable internal state. I guess organisms also develop, right? They grow from a single cell and then live out their lives. So I guess that's the sort of intuitive sense of what an organism is, but let's look at some problem cases. So first of all, consider, I don't know how to pronounce this, Dictyostelium discoideum, which is a kind of slime mold. When circumstances are good and resources are abundant, these entities will live as single independent cells. When resources become more scarce, they send out chemical signals to attract other cells, and they clump together in groups of over 100,000 cells to form a kind of slug-like structure. And this slug can move around as a single entity. It's sort of responsive to the environment, it responds to light, and it will try to climb to a high point. When it gets to somewhere high, the individual cells will then differentiate into specialized cells. So, for example, it has sentinel cells, which act as immune cells and destroy pathogens. Some cells form a fruiting body with a stalk and spores, and the fruiting body disperses the spores, while all of the other cells, other than the spores, die without reproducing. So from the point of view of the cell, joining this slug incurs a very serious cost, because there's a good chance it will just fail to reproduce. It just won't be part of the spores that are sent out. And this is presumably why the slug is only generated when resources are scarce. So the question is then, is the slime mold slug an aggregation of cells, or is it literally an organism? I mean, if we say that this slug is it literally an organism, then it seems like during part of its life, its parts are kind of scattered all over. Another interesting case are clonal colonies of aspen trees. So as aspen trees are shown in this image here, we'd probably think of each individual tree as being a single organism. But it turns out that these trees are connected by a network of underground runners. So they're all physically connected in the root system. And what happens is that a tree will send out runners. These runners are basically genetically identical to the old tree. These grow and they become new trees, or they maybe contact other runners and fuse with them. And so the whole aspen grove sort of shares a network of roots. They share nutrients, and they're all very genetically similar. So biologists will draw a distinction between the rammet and the genet, right? We would say of the aspen grove that there are many distinct rammets, but there's a single genet, a single genetic individual. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those words correctly. I'm usually not, so you might want to check that. Anyway, so is this the growth of a single organism, or is it a form of reproduction? You know, it's like when the tree sends out its rammets, is that growth, or is it reproducing? Is it producing new organisms? What's going on here? Or consider lichen. So lichen are formed by a symbiotic relationship between species of fungi and green algae or cyanobacteria. They consist of the fungi consist of these filaments, right? There are filaments of multiple types of fungi which provide protection to the algae, and they gather nutrients from the environment, which the algae then use. And on the other hand, the algae perform photosynthesis and provide carbohydrates to the fungi. So there's this intertwined relationship. Lichen have quite an important ecological role. They can survive in very harsh environments. They're often the very first kind of life to invade an area, and then they allow other plants to follow. Now, the fungi can live alone in the right environment, given the right kind of nutritional input, but that's rare. So it's quite a tight relationship they have. There are different methods of reproduction in lichen, but at least some of them form specialized structures that contain both the algae and the fungi. So although these two species are distantly related genetically, their reproduction is intertwined. They reproduce as one. Finally, think about honeybee colonies. Honeybee colonies are highly integrated entities containing tens of thousands of bees. Members of the colony have very sophisticated methods of communication, so there are special forms of dancing to organise foraging, and that helps to maintain the functional integration of the colony. There's a strict division of labour, with bees organised into castes that perform different functions. And in particular, most members of the colony are sterile. Only the queen and the male drones reproduce. The female workers can't have any offspring. So we kind of have this reproductive division of labour, similarly to how in the human body you've got the germ and the soma, right? You've got specialised reproductive cells. Many biologists think of honeybee colonies as being superorganisms. These are sort of higher level organisms made up of the individual bees. And so, one question here is, well, how do we distinguish a true superorganism from a mere aggregate of organisms, like a herd of buffalo? So those are just a few cases that pose some difficulties for our intuitive conception of what an organism is. Now, I think it's kind of worth just sort of thinking about where the problem of the organism sort of comes from. Clark and Akasha, in their article Species and Organisms, suggest that there are basically two sources of difficulty. So first of all, there's vagueness, right? There are various borderline cases of organisms. There are entities that have some properties of organisms, but not all the properties. Now, of course, vagueness is a general problem. It afflicts all of our predicates. There's the classic Socrates paradox of, if you have a heap of sand, how many grains do you have to remove before it's no longer a heap, right? So vagueness is a very general philosophical problem. But what Clark and Akasha point out is that this problem is kind of magnified in biology. And that's for two reasons. First of all, in biology, there's widespread variation. Variation is sort of constantly being produced without limit. The the kind of evolutionary processes are just constantly exploring new ways of generating living entities. And secondly, there's the gradualness of evolutionary processes. Change occurs very slowly, so often you're not going to be able to draw clear lines. There are going to be many cases of entities that are sort of intermediate between two states. So, for those reasons, it's going to be very difficult to tell, in many cases, whether an entity has a certain property that we think is important for individuality. But a second source of difficulty is the problem of multiple criteria. And this is just the fact that many different defining criteria of individuality have been proposed. And these criteria don't have the same extension, in the sense that they will count different entities as being individuals. And of course we'll see some of the criteria in the next couple of videos. So let's start with the genetic criterion. So the basic idea here is that two entities are part of the same organism if they are genetically identical, or at least genetically similar enough. I mean, it's not going to be exact, right? But they're pretty much genetically identical. Different organisms are the ones that are genetically distinct, and that's, I think, fairly intuitive. With humans, all of the cells in my heart have the same genome as all of the cells in my brain. They have the same genome as all of the cells in my legs. So every human cell in my body has the same genome. Now, if I were to reproduce, the genome of my child would be very different. It would be a mixture of my genes with my partner's genes. So if you just look at the genes, we can draw a clear distinction between individuals. Now, of course, humans do have a host of symbiotic bacteria, like the gut bacteria, for instance, which we need to survive. So on this criterion, the gut bacteria would not count as being part of the human organism, which I suppose that seems fairly intuitive, I guess. So to take the example of the clonal aspen trees, on this view, the genet is the proper organism and the ramets are the parts. So the whole grove of the aspen trees is literally one huge organism. When a new tree is created, that's really just growth of a single individual. It's not reproduction. Now, an immediate concern you might have about this criterion is single-celled organisms. If we say that genetic identity is what matters, then we're going to have to say that when a bacterium divides, this is growth rather than the creation of a new individual, because the new bacterium will have almost exactly the same genome as the older one. There may be slight differences due to mutation, but no more than you get when human cells divide. So the two bacteria count as the same organism. But that looks a little bit ridiculous. So I think what the defender of the genetic criterion would want to say here is that there's a fundamental difference between single-celled and multicellular creatures. In a world of only bacteria, it's perfectly straightforward what counts as the individual. It's just the cell, right? So if there was nothing but bacteria, there would be no problem of biological individuality. Problems only arise when we have multicellular entities. So the point of the genetic criterion is to give us a way of distinguishing one multicellular individual from another. So this criterion, I guess, isn't going to be completely general. It applies to multicellular organisms. Okay, so why then does genetic homogeneity matter? Why do we care whether things are genetically identical? Well, the point is that genetic homogeneity reduces conflict between the genomes. Biologists will often distinguish different levels of entities, right? You have molecules, and then cells, and then organs, and organisms, and demes, and species, and ecosystems, and so on, in a kind of ascending hierarchy. So the thought here is that if an organism were genetically heterogeneous, if it were made up of loads of cells that all have different genomes, then selection would occur at the cellular level. The cells would be competing with each other, and that would destroy the higher level integration of the organism. because some of the genomes would be superior to others, and so would be selected and would proliferate at the expense of others. The point here is that natural selection requires variance. If there is no variation among the genes, then among the genes in each cell, then there will be no selection among the cells. So the genetic homogeneity, it reduces competition, and that's what allows you to have an integrated organism. So it's a fairly intuitive criterion, but it does have some problems. So first of all, consider cases like monozygotic twins. On the genetic criterion, it looks like they're going to count as basically two scattered parts of the same biological organism because they have the same genes. And that just seems kind of ridiculous. Surely monozygotic twins are different people. I suppose one possible response to this would be to say, well, look, we're dealing with biological individuality. The question is, what is a biological organism? Now, for the purposes of psychology, for the purposes of social relationships, obviously we treat monozygotic twins as being different individuals. Monozygotic twins are different people, right? Personhood is a kind of social matter or a psychological matter. But that doesn't necessarily mean they should be treated as different biological individuals. The biological individual is a more technical concept. And so in the same way that a grove of aspen trees all count as the same biological individual, maybe the two monozygotic twins do as well. Maybe that makes it a little bit more plausible, but it still seems kind of absurd. So another problem is posed by cases of chimerism and mosaicism. In the case of chimerism, an organism develops from the fusion of two embryos, causing it to be a mixture of cells with different genomes. A particularly striking example are the marmosets. Marmosets give birth to dizygotic twins, but during pregnancy, links are established between the two placentas and cells from the embryos are exchanged. A similar thing can happen in humans, although it is quite rare. Two embryos can combine to produce a single baby. And if the original embryos were of different sexes, then you get the interesting case of an XXXY chimera. Mosaicism is another problem. Mosaicism is ubiquitous. This just refers to the way in which the genomes in the cells of an organism diverge over time due to mutation. So that's perfectly routine. As your cells divide, there are going to be mistakes, and so there will be a gradual divergence in terms of the genes. Now, if we consider, for instance, oak trees, in oak trees, offspring are produced from each branch, right? So each branch is an independent site of reproduction. Now, due to mosaicism, as the new branches grow, the genomes of the cells gradually change. The cells divide, mutations accumulate, the genomes gradually change. So let's take two branches, A and B, and suppose that branch A of this tree produces a new tree. Well, branch A will be genetically more similar to the new tree than it is to branch B. Branch A and B may have a significant amount of difference between them. They may have diverged hundreds of years ago. So would we say then that A and B are different organisms, whereas A and the new tree are the same organism? That seems outrageous. So that's a problem. And finally, a third issue with the genetic criterion is, well, even if we accept that genetic homogeneity is important, and I think it is important, it seems to sort of miss the point in that the genetic criterion doesn't tell us anything about how homogeneity is maintained. So it could be that a set of entities is genetically homogeneous just by chance. So maybe these entities are such that they could diverge very easily. It's just that the environmental pressures haven't yet caused that. So we might think that what matters isn't really genetic homogeneity in itself, but rather the general integration of the organism. Genetic homogeneity is just one sign of this integration. What we really want from a criterion of individuality is an explanation of what it is that actually holds an individual together as a single unit. And genetic homogeneity is, as I say, it is important, but perhaps it doesn't really answer that question. Okay, a view which has recently been defended by Thomas Pradot, or Pradot, is the immunity criterion, which draws on immunology. So Pradot sees the organism as a self-contained entity, which is distinguished from the rest of the environment and defends itself from environmental threats. And this is achieved through the immune system. So we can essentially take the immune system as defining the boundaries of the organism. And this has some historical basis, because immunology has long been considered the science of self and non-self. Foreign entities, the things that are recognised as non-self, trigger an immune response, while the constituent entities, those that are recognised as self, do not, at least in normal circumstances when the immune system is functioning correctly. So I guess the point is, why not just use the immune system to determine what counts as an organism, right? It's defined in terms of the immune response. And so notice that on this view, entities like the gut bacteria would straightforwardly count as part of the human organism, because the human immune system allows them to exist within us, right? The human organism, the human immune system recognizes those the gut bacteria as being part of the self. It doesn't attack them. So in that kind of case, this is quite clearly distinguished from the genetic criterion. Now, there are two basic arguments given by Pradot for why we should think that the immune system is so important. First of all, he says the immune system is a mechanism of inclusion, right? It decides what to accept and what to reject, and so as such it plays an essential role in establishing the boundaries of the organism. The immune system establishes, right, what's included, what's rejected. It ensures the unity of the organism. I guess an important point to note here is that the vast majority of things that go on in your body are modular. You have like the circulatory system, the nervous system, respiration, digestion. All of these processes occur in specific places of your body. They use specific parts of your body. On the other hand, the immune system acts everywhere. It has a kind of surveillance of your entire body. So that's why we can sort of use the immune system to distinguish one organism from another, because the immune system, I guess almost by definition, is going to be surveilling the body as a whole. A second point is that the immune system is a self-policing mechanism. It prevents the proliferation of the lower level entities that compose the organism. So, there's a general problem that all higher level individuals face, right? Their integrity and their unity depends on the suppression of the fitness of the entities that constitute them. So if you take a human cell, if that cell starts just replicating without constraint, well, obviously that cell is in a certain sense fitter than other cells, but what you have there is a cancer. If a cell just starts replicating as much as possible, that's really bad, and it destroys the integrity of the higher level organism. So every higher level individual needs a policing mechanism. It needs to eliminate those constituent parts that favour their own fitness rather than the fitness of the whole. And that's what the immune system is involved with. So that's an interesting idea. There are some problems. One concern that I guess is more of a historical concern now is that it was once thought that many organisms just don't have immune systems. Traditionally, the main focus in immunology has been on lymphocytes, which are a certain type of white blood cell that are involved in destroying pathogens. Most organisms don't have lymphocytes. I guess perhaps a worry here is just, this criterion is not going to apply to a lot of the biosphere. Now, it turns out that more recent research has kind of expanded the concept of immunity. It does seem that all organisms exhibit specific biochemical reactions that are used to reject foreign entities. And in this sense, they all have immune systems. For instance, in bacteria and archaea, CRISPR is a kind of adaptive immunity. You've probably heard of the CRISPR-Cas9 editing technology, the gene editing technology. That's the sort of latest craze in biology. Well, the basis of this technology is CRISPR. CRISPR basically contains it's certain kinds of DNA sequences in bacteria and archaea. So if a bacterium is attacked by a virus and then fights it off, it will save snippets of the virus's DNA, and these snippets of DNA are used to detect any similar viruses that try to attack again. So this is a kind of adaptive immunity. So it looks like we can probably apply the concept of the immune system to other organisms. However, another problem with the immune criterion is that it rests on the notion of correct functioning of the immune system. So there are pathological cases, obviously, where the immune system attacks the body or it fails to attack foreign entities. That may well be a problem, but we wouldn't want to say that an entity stops being an organism in this case. So it's not so much that we're using the immune system to determine what counts as an organism, rather we're using the properly functioning immune system. Now, there are a couple of concerns about this. I mean, one concern that we might raise is just if we're talking about the correctly functioning immune system, we're introducing normative judgments into science, right? Because we have to judge what counts as correct functioning as opposed to incorrect functioning. That's a tricky area, and it's quite a big area. I do have a video on functions in biology, which you might want to check out, but I won't go into it here. But more importantly, even if the idea of correct functioning is perfectly legitimate, I mean, what exactly is a correctly functioning immune system, right? I mean, how do we tell whether or not an immune system is functioning correctly? Well, it seems to me like the natural answer is the correctly functioning immune system is one that attacks foreign entities, but not the constituent parts of the organism, right? It's one that attacks the self and attacks the non-self and protects the self, right? So now we need a prior concept of organism to define what counts as a correctly functioning immune system, right? So, do you see the problem there? In order to tell whether or not an immune system is functioning correctly, we need to have a prior understanding of what the organism is. So I think that maybe is a bit more of a serious problem. Finally, we might worry, I guess maybe going back to this first problem, if we're going to expand the concept of immunity to include cases like CRISPR, what else is included? I mean, I guess the question here is just, in general, right, what is immunity? Is immunity just any system for defending an entity? I mean, certainly, if you think about the human immune system, well, it's a very different kind of thing from CRISPR in bacteria. Prideaux himself suggests that we also find immunity in honeybee colonies. Colonies can have an immune system because the individual bees will, for instance, there will be bees that guard and control the entrance to the colony. So they kind of control what comes in and what comes out. There are bees that will remove any diseased bees from the nests. And so, again, there seems to be a kind of colony-level immunity there. Individual bees will act as the immune system for the colony. But I mean, again, this is a sort of metaphor, right? And the worry is, if we're going to say that this is literally a kind of immunity, then I mean, what counts as immunity? Because in almost any collection of entities, you can find behaviours for rejecting foreigners and defending the collection of entities, right? So in human societies, for instance, we have militaries that defend the society against threats and so on. I mean, the point is that something like a human military, it seems, is not considered a kind of immunity, right? Because human societies are not considered organisms. So again, as in the second problem, we need a prior concept of what an organism is. Right? If we were to say that human societies were organisms, then you'd probably identify the military capacity as being part of the immunity of the organism. Right? But it's because that we recognise they're not organisms that we don't look for an immune system. So, again, it seems like we're going to have trouble using the concept of immunity to define the organism because we need a prior concept of organism to define what immunity is. Okay, so that's all for today, and we will continue looking at biological individuality very shortly. Thanks for watching.